당은 아쟁아제 아가르진다 가는데 개와 디포포야 당 개와 주에 되려야 냠는 디폼 그룹 첼이야 저 당아저 가르고 그러시네 당아저 셈디 남예원도 송아지네 디폼 그 지개와 주변에 개와 잡고지 용마도 받더니 개와 yap고지 두마들이 되니 디도죠 안에 지게 디파티게 yap고지 몸도 봐준 거래 대인자다 이제 이제게 디버폰 알이야 개와 두고 개와디 yap고 주발라 다 셈디 아 전시신 대체 안에 지게 봐셈 남예매 봐지 안에 셈 요모 초스다 봐 도르가 송제네 되니 셈 개회 초스미 받대지 아무도 두시네 냠내 치고 거래스 지자인자 땅은 저기 대시시 송아텔이야 안에 지게 침부래서 아도스네 인자 되네자 그 생각도디 주바다 지산 지게 침부이자다 데 안에 안지시와나 침비기 바도르디지 송도 갑라 양저 셈 송아 되바 남기 남나니스를 젠바단의 시신다 탐지 베비 손시지 당이니 데이터 탐어저 세네 키싱 도슈로와 제사디니자다 아주기 디포폰 개와 중에 냠내지 타바다 탐지 김보 고방 토버 되바 남기 네 가지고르스네 셈디 녀모베 초소 안에 마땅와제 기회 전시신이 바电제 녀모베 마땅 셈디바 송아 되고 냠내지바 되바는 게 되네기 전시신 때에 셈디 뒤참제를 송고거래서 배주에 진의 송고거래서 되네 소바이나 냠내디 하성고 권여보도 배주 두그래 되네자다 셈송에 개침보래 셈송에 개침보자 되래 송나데 근성의 전시신 때에 송고거래 돼야 한 뒤지 타 살지마에 바치 모두 유제 배주에 지제 전주시네 안에 송고거래에서다 셈 송아에게 탑론 전시신 때에 송고거래에서 also introduction to the somebody taking out the tissues
Good evening. So we're continuing to look at the 5th chapter in Shantideva's remarkable text, where he's presenting the great importance of mindfulness and vigilance. So we, as practitioners of the Dharma, need to embrace wholeheartedly these minds of mindfulness and vigilance, because the very way of transforming our minds, of spiritually developing, is to accumulate virtue and to purify non-virtue. And this is done through training our mind. Because it's through this process of training our mind that we accumulate virtue, which means we become ever more habituated to virtuous ways of thinking. This is how we accumulate virtue. And to the extent we are developing our habituation to wholesome, virtuous ways of thinking, to that extent, we are breaking our habituation to unwholesome, non-virtuous ways of thinking. And this is how we purify our mind from these harmful, habitual ways of thinking. So to train our mind, to develop this strong familiarization with wholesome ways of thinking, we have to rely on mindfulness and vigilance. Without mindfulness and vigilance, we will not be able to hold virtuous ways of thinking long. We will not even notice unwholesome ways of thinking. So this is why mindfulness and vigilance is so important, and why it is the very topic of this chapter. And also, it is the reason why this great Bodhisattva, Shantideva, in the final verse we looked at last week, the 23rd verse, he implored us with folded hands, saying, all those who wish to protect this mind, guard mindfulness and vigilance as you do your life. Here I'm referring to bodhicitta. So whatever extent we have drawn near to cultivating bodhicitta, to ensure that we both maintain and grow that, we have to rely on mindfulness and vigilance. That is the only way that we can develop these wholesome minds. And moreover, to rely on mindfulness and vigilance sporadically, for example, when engaged in formal practice such as now or at home, this is insufficient. At all times, both in formal practice and as we go about our day, we need to ensure our mind stays virtuous. And to do so, we need to rely constantly at all times on mindfulness and vigilance.
전 시시 매바이나 네 자와 칸라이나 자와 카르치베네 네 개위 자와 카르치베네 니가 추초마다 니부 친구용 통고 말해서 한 견디는 슝그레스 제다 되네 아지 전 시시 매바이나 안 가르치고 그래서네 내가 저기 아주 냠내 이제 셰럽되기나 푸순 소봉고 공부도 그 조통 말해 제다 네 전 시시 엄마 템바이나 안 수르미 하고 소통 말해 제나 되네 안 전 시시 마템바이나 아니 아주 가르어서네 되네 녀마 사시베 개와디 반냠도 그래서 되네 안전 시시마 템바이나 네 지게 아주 개와서도 사발이야 바시시 그래서 안 되네 기다 전 시시나 마템바나 되네 되네 녀바튼 슝그래서 아주 오두신마 슈버다 된마
그렇게 거기서 그랬지.
개와서도 개왕아 사바디에 개와 냠그래서 개와서도 제발라 바시시 그래서 개체데 아니 개와서 사투 말해서
To present in more detail the need for mindfulness and vigilance, to the extent it lacks, to the extent that our mindfulness and vigilance is lacking, whatever virtuous endeavors we engage in will be weak because our mental application will be weak. Our mind will be distracted. It will return to thinking about anything that appears in the mind rather than the virtuous activity we are trying to cultivate. Moreover, our intelligence, our wisdom will not develop because when we are trying to develop our wisdom, develop our understanding of the Dharma, this weak virtuous mind will struggle. We will continue to be distracted by afflictions and so forth. Moreover, or thirdly, our ethics will be patchy at best. At times, we'll try and be ethical, but all too often, when the afflictions arise, pushing us in an unethical direction, we won't even be aware. So these are some of the faults that follow if one isn't relying closely on mindfulness and vigilance. And moreover, one's previously accumulated virtue with some efforts that one had accumulated, this will decline because our non-virtue will be growing. And moreover, because of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance closely, this will serve as an obstacle to the accumulation of new virtue. So continuing in the text, and here Shantideva is presenting a further fault of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, which is that any virtuous activity we go in will lack power. In other words, the virtue we accumulate will be weak. So the 24th verse, those agitated by illness lack the strength or capacity to engage in any activity. Likewise, minds agitated by the ignorance or confusion lack the strength or capacity to engage in any activity.
never chapa in Nasorda, Negi to be Midani, Tenigi, near Masavi, near Makivi Nila, Rosubo, Tumbo, Yaga Karina, Jana Yova, Beds Langsort Tempa, Yavuch Yovache. That Denigi Yavu Yorte, that Denigi Tej Neji, Subola Neji Leode, the Neki Tupas and Nei Pai, Dapchipa Subolia, Dan Deode, Dene, Lenum Kula, Tume Basido, Le Paso, Dui Chawana, Kumbaja, Droma Tupa, and thereby about Matuba. Kisheba in a Yabushima, Numa Usmi, Jawati Beji, Kisheba and Peki, Chojuma de Shimatuba. The name Pazu Drova and a Galis Mother Dromatuba, or Dushinet, and the Lagar which live in a Peci Guinea, that's just Mother Liamatuba, Dushine, and the Chilia Carshebe, Ye Sadi Pazu Drongi, Jawa Le, and the answer Sosuke Larachi, that Kala Soya loss of father, some Soya loss of Shingi Le loss of Carrier, Harachevena. It's just not the Chetugo Maris, Kizimanashi, Chetugo Maris, Kaseshugo Maris, Chetugo Maris. The Niki Nubo Yomarche, Nubo Yopara. Nubo Meba the Karajebaresina, could ne Nazi again. Ne the Kienje, the Nuba Master short, as one that.
Look in the first two lines. Those agitated by illness lack the strength or capacity to engage in any activity. So if you think of someone, perhaps ourselves, who at a time when we were healthy and skilled, so we'd learned various, we had developed certain qualities, we were able to go about our life at a particular level. But then when struck down by illness, we recognize that our capacity or strength has been consumed now by illness. But and then having our strength and capacity consumed by illness, we'll struggle to engage in any kind of physical or verbal activity before our strength once again is exhausted. Likewise, our capacity to engage in mental activity, that too is greatly weakened by our illness, because our mental strength is weak. So we see this great change that can come through through the decline in our health and the impact it has on the endeavors we engage in.
Sangile Deva Yuba, Kewachi, Tumba Yuba, Beva Yuba, Numbian Kewaruchik, Njiuba, the next Yuba in a Dagazine, Jen Shijin Den Warriors, and the Jen Shijin, Matimbache, and the Palm, Simdi, and the Chi, Yombo Chosupa, Dang Javaina, and got Nikaji was in it in the Chadan Kigres, the Chala Sopa, the Controla Sopa, and I yell and the Kiwi Java, the Niki, Chesa. Radishin Mombe, Sim to Be, Sida Chesa, Dejin, Namua Zugim, Deji, Sidi, Betinashin, so sweet and Bokewala, Kewachi, because Fanny Chilla, Deva Yuba, and Jikewachi, Chidik, Tanu, Tumbo Yuba, Kiwi Chavala, Changanju, Lara Dina Kewa to French in the Yam. That day she's in Matibache, Sem de Pa, Yomobo, Choso Tamba Ina, Trochubaina, and the Garsene, and the Sem de, Yomoba Kiao, Tene. Bangja Karabanguri by Langja Halang City, Panyamlin Chegi, Rimbati, Mong Hamo or Child would essence the Mong Bears, Chizadinigi, Banangi, Yamnecheta, Hamo or Chimoni, that work, Yomo will choose by Simba to Stashaba. The Nigi Mong by the Mong be, the Nipachi Sim to a Shakiad, Hondo Yad, and Mayad, Chato Yad, the Nigi some of the Kiadu, the next some of the two chairs, so some of the two chairs, some two glorious, the Shimon be Sim to pass a disorder.
To complete.
Yes.
Now the comparison is drawn from the ordinary world to the spiritual world. Here in third line, likewise, minds agitated by the ignorance of confusion. So here we think of ourselves when we have faith, due to faith in the Buddha Dharma, and thereby wanting to cultivate the minds of the Buddha Dharma, wanting to spiritually develop, fulfill our potential, we engage in virtue. But if we are not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, what will happen is our mind will quickly go back to what it's habituated to thinking about. and all too quickly, the virtuous way of thinking that we had cultivated will be lost due to the afflictions such as distraction. So this happens all too easily. And it's because of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, because mindfulness and vigilance would play the role of mindfulness, ensuring that whatever virtuous mind we had cultivated remains dominant. Vigilance would ensure that dominance of the virtuous mind doesn't decline, or no affliction arises to lead the mind astray. But if mindfulness and vigilance are lacking, then all too quickly, pride may arise about just how virtuous I am, or one may engage in competitive thinking with others, or attachment to something or aversion towards something else may well arise. And then what we were engaging in is forgotten. In fact, the general presentation that we have come to learn, what are the virtuous minds to cultivate and what should be abandoned, these we've forgotten, because now those minds that should be abandoned are the ones, once again, dominating us, and we end up cultivating these afflicted minds. This is what happens when we are not being held by mindfulness and vigilance. This term agitated, we should understand that the mind is agitated from its virtues. Some virtuous motivation has been cultivated, and by the afflictions, it's agitated towards non-virtue. And then, in the fourth line, our mind now lacks the strength or capacity to engage in any activity. So here, we have generated a virtuous motivation. We've embarked on a virtuous activity. Maybe we're doing a physical virtuous activity, or a verbal virtuous activity, or solely a mental virtuous activity. But we've generated a wholesome motivation. We're engaging in that activity, but now our mind has been lost to the afflictions once again. So we had cultivated a good motivation and engaged in the virtuous activity. So virtue is accumulated, but it is weak. It's incomparably weak to what we have the capacity for, should we have relied on mindfulness and vigilance. Should we have utilized mindfulness and vigilance to hold our virtuous mind, that same amount of time and energy would have resulted in so much more virtue. sem chagwe choso nyomo ge chagwe ge yul pa de ma ga ba je sen pa da ja ba je sem de le chagwe ge de chagwe ge wan so de ye je zan de ne za sem tu pas je za de lang ja da mo bang ja ka len ba de bang go ba de ni so ha mo mo ba je de ni yo ma sem tu che sem an tu de je de ne ge wa tu yo de ne ge wa de chun shu ma de yong go ma re se he be ru de ju ga da. I think it's a given illustration. You set a wholesome motivation, generate refuge and bodhicitta, and now you're going to engage in a virtuous activity, maybe if something physical, such as prostration, or something verbal, such as mantra recitation, whatever it may be. So you've generated a wholesome motivation, and now you embark on your virtuous endeavor. But not relying on mindfulness and vigilance without them holding your virtuous mind in place, very quickly the afflictions will arise. Most probably, minds such as attachment to one's friends or loved ones, thinking about what they're doing, looking forward to seeing them later. Or maybe the various activities you need to do. There's the attachment to all these worldly activities that consume so much of our time. So our to-do list, all the things to do after we've done our mantra recitation or prostrations, that may appear to one's mind. Or one may, thoughts of pride being expressed as competitiveness may come, thinking, I'm doing so much more than this person or that person. Or related to this, thinking of your reputation. I'm probably becoming known for all these prostrations I'm doing, all these mantras I'm reciting. This way of thinking, not overly surprising. This is how ordinary people think. And they think in this way because of the ignorance of confusion. Confusion over what should be abandoned, these kinds of afflicted ways of thinking, and what should be adopted, which both includes virtuous activities such as cultivating a motivation, prostrations, mantra recitation, as well as relying on mindfulness and vigilance to ensure that our mind remains virtuous and isn't drawn away. So therefore, our ignorance of confusion, this continues to mislead us. We remain enshrouded by this thick darkness. And whilst we do create some virtue from what we've done, the results remain feeble, nothing like we could have accumulated if our mind had been utilizing mindfulness and vigilance.
So magawi meeting ata meeting pedugja yorazim samna meeting ale den never kisa meeting pedugj den samtan den chewa member yorazim samtavena cheda kewa dugo de samno dipini shalia energy magawi number control number stende samtan digoro den ezade ko samno dipatan zeta kewa dugo de nunga kewa dugo dina kewa de shukshunju madeyo marensashi adeso ane azegi nyamnyor de az de kendele yomina az
What can also happen all too easily is one, again, is engaging in this virtuous activity, but rather than the mind wandering off to in the direction of or being pulled off by attachment, it's violently pulled away by anger. You're thinking about what someone said to you, what someone did, and your mind is now consumed with negative thoughts towards someone. So once again, one's accumulated virtue, but that virtue remains feeble. But also, now because one's mind has become afflicted, not only is the virtue feeble, but one too accumulates non-virtue. So this is what I'm describing. I don't think is a stranger to anyone. We know this happens.
Shandalaya, Kota Samdigo, Marco Jango, Jagoma, Tajika, Shingo Marsenbigi, the consulia, Tonjo, and associating Aya, when not some degree, Dene, and I get it in a Odushin, some I get it in a Kio to win it, Zangi Kawati in the Chushum Madeo Mars, Adushin and answering your model, Chigushin, some data to share in somewhere in that, Dene is other Consusi Kawachi, Teva, Junior, Timber. Chele debache kewa tuwa ine jan shi shi ma tenbache semdi chadangi wando tang dene kewa dunga kewa kar tuwa ine kewa den nipa chunchu mado yomane es jesang lus da jesadi nyeba chunchu mado meba de karshi bari lana sem ma suwa jan shi shi ma tenbache sem nyomo wando tangwa inza jan shi shi ma tenbache kyun ri es nyeba de es wada.
Where else one sees this all too easily is when doing one's daily commitments. If one isn't relying on mindfulness and vigilance, your mind is not on that meditative practice one's meant to be engaging in, but is all over the show. Or when you've been in retreat, instead of your mind remaining within the retreat boundaries, it's going all over. Instead of abiding in virtue, it's going all over, thinking, here I am, look what I'm doing. I'm doing my commitments every day, or I'm now here in retreat, unlike this person or that person. And here, the mind is now afflicted. And instead of using this portion of one's day to accumulate merit, one's mind is distracted, and the merit that could have been accumulated, whilst accumulated, is weak. It's feeble. And all this effort just results in a small attainment because of not utilizing mindfulness and vigilance.
Anda dine zada andan dine ki kewa tudan demen dübe de yoba de kan şeore sedadi gün de ba du sen ten şiz nan java ina gün deniz kewa tube ne dübe çujuma da yoma de gün deniz yore sonyodu da dönda di doşol da de anona de yönden de kare su gün meva da dübe çibo yoba de kare şeore sedi dan zo lapçı len di di sungor da de dönda la kare go di go da 제자당 안저 기회 자와 가래 제비네 ten şizin de 안능아 저기 변에 군노 다보 군노 다 대해야 돼 템바들이야 다보 군노 되게 파트해야 돼 어디 군노 되는 쇼워서 배 템바대다 되네 봐도 아니 검기비 가로 시신기 봐 심 요모쇼 주고 뒤면의 선배 삼로 다시 봐 안지 개와든 예주야 제해야다 되네 아직 유 개비 상계다 담마다 상계리야 대바제 제해야다 지소 제바제 시신 대제 제해들이와 되네 자당 지금 나보고라네 수수께다 최법부야시 제 만지시 부기나다 대연자 최법을 부기나다 개왕아 아시사베네 개와 가래 제비나 다보 공원들이야 다지게 심자다 저 코의 동화들에 자고 심자들 대화도 받아 동화미도 찍바이 심자들이 대화대 템버쇼 심비에 삼는다 심자들 동화단 자와쇼 제자다 심자들 검송 코의 동화들 제비 껴봐 니버데 술로 열었으니 잡혀 건졌으니 열에 잡혀 건졌으니 껴클리 선배기 이시체 제네데네 하나 저게 제자 디네자 예심자 탐제라 팬디기 주위에 단달이야 하는 게디 아니지야 사이 야 유익이 땅아 상계다 남마다 상계 되길이야 아니 소디 슈구여 선배다는 디디야 라마다 상계게 구송 투송 건졌음기 구송 투송 연된 전제 될 때바 제지도 제 안데네게 군로들이야 되지 잠니지 군로 제군이노 안데야 편지 주에 샘제 탐지 동화세 디기 주비하게 체도 디니셰 디네 안데야 안지 샘제 안 디유던달다 상계 라마다 상계를 대바 제시도 제자 안도시는 삼다쟁한 쪽에다 지게 최고부야다 최고부야 나다 다 지게 나로 사베나다 소수요 곰 가르켜베나다 노시는 곰 잡아이나 나 디니게 가야디 전시신 된제 다 지자 셈디 명목을 주서 마다와 셈차사 기회 줘다 군노자의 셈 잠니지 군내라야다 제도 저와 셈제 탐제를 폐하게 된다 안지 유 대비 유 군조숨이야 군조다 라마다 상계리야 대바 지지도 제대 노시는 삼다지랑 아기고는 아사야다 같은 된바이나다 안에 지게 안 저게 잠니지라서 봤다 다음에 봐서 가르코면 도스콤 야 디니기 갑리야 아직 시신기 셈디 아직 남명의 초 파도 되면도 파 제버 때다네 나 조요 봐 하고 나 남사 파 젬비 텐지 어디 영 조요 말 땅교 말 셈비 템바 텐지 셈디 기회 쇼서 파 송야다 나 전시진이도 석다요 셈디 기회 쇼다 다다 네게는 다라 샤지도 신 고미야 공부를 해서라 아 데네기 냠는 제바이나 다고 개와디다 개와 나보치 청이레스 개와 벤디고 친구 차기 나보치 유바다 때마 최고 그래서 가슴 굴로 잠이 지고 군에다 체도 잡아 생제 탐지게도 나 체도 잡아 야 제비요 아니 랑기 라마다 상계 건조스미야 고선도 유인된 잼비도네 대바 지치도 제제 셈다 전시인 되네 셈디 되네게 기회 주로 땅제 다 줄이기 차세바 있나다 나유권에 아니 저기 송화사바 있나다 나기 뛰어바로 된바 있나다 되네 지금 체매 부여다 연자 부여다 가르쳐봐 가르쳐봐 되네 곰 잡아 있나 또 잡아 있나다 이 천량아 저기 gewa and Nubachim Chagor, Echeza to the Nubachim Dik, all those in the Yaman Chagor, yes, as soon more than any borders.
So this particular section we're in this text is presenting the faults of lacking mindfulness and vigilance. So it should be clear, if one does not rely on mindfulness and vigilance, although one is making some efforts in virtuous activities, the virtue created will be weak because the mind stays so easily overwhelmed by the afflictions or merely just drawn away by minds such as distraction, afflictions such as distraction. So Shantideva has presented, I think, quite clearly some of the many faults of not relying well on mindfulness and vigilance. Then to talk about the benefits of relying on mindfulness and vigilance, well, it's just the opposite. The same endeavor leads to a vast accumulation of merit. So let's take an illustration to make this clear. Then you sit down in the morning, you're going to embark on some meditation. First thing you do, even before you start your meditation practice, because normally we'd say you start with motivation. So set as your pre-motivation, I will rely on mindfulness and vigilance from now throughout my practice and throughout my day. So set this clear motivation. I will make efforts to rely on mindfulness and vigilance throughout this practice and throughout my day. And then one starts. One starts by moving through your practice, but the whole time vigilance is watching, ensuring that as you move through your practice, your mind is staying on the practice. What is mindfulness doing? It is holding the various parts of your practice, making sure they are held. So these are being recalled. This is the purpose of mindfulness, and vigilance is making sure that is happening. So one sits down, sets the motivation or the pre-motivation. I am going to rely on mindfulness and vigilance. Then one starts, and one always starts with refuge. One starts with refuge, will follow into properly making offerings, and then engage in whatever virtuous activity that you have set out. Maybe it'll be a meditation on bodhicitta, maybe it will be your various commitments, maybe some mantra recitation, whatever it may be. So you're starting out, you've made your pre-motivation commitment to mindfulness and vigilance. You then start generating your motivation of refuge and bodhicitta. And you start by reflecting on sufferings, the sufferings of the lower realms that potentially await you because the non-virtue previously accumulated. And you recognize that not only is this a distinct possibility that I may well fall to the lower realms, but that is where mother sentient beings are suffering now. In the same way that you recall the kinds of sufferings that are there and potentially await you, you recognize kind mother beings are suffering like this right now. Then you recognize the sufferings of the higher realms that you have experienced, and you recognize that there are others experiencing these and even worse right now. Who has the capacity to guide beings to protection from such suffering? It is the three jewels, and this is now where we start to go for refuge, and you reflect on the qualities of the three jewels. So you first reflect on the faults of cyclic existence. You generate this determination, this need to turn somewhere for protecting refuge. And then you reflect on the qualities of the three jewels. And then wholeheartedly, your heart opens to the three jewels, and you turn to them for protection and guidance. And then one goes for refuge. And accompanying this is the meditation of bodhicitta, recognizing that my mother sentient beings need me. They need a guidance from as many bodhisattvas as possible. I have to become a bodhisattva and then a Buddha so that I can help beings gain freedom. So here one generates bodhicitta. And as one embarks on the recitation of the refuge and bodhicitta verse, the refuge and bodhicitta verse, one imagines before oneself the Buddha, seeing as inseparable in nature from one's lama, and request their blessings, their inspiration, that in this meditation, through continuing to rely on mindfulness and vigilance, the instructions, meditation instructions you received in teachings, that you actualize them within you so as to be of ever greater benefit to others. And that through this process, you aid them, the Buddhas and the lamas, in the many virtuous activities to benefit beings. And then you've cultivated refuge and bodhicitta. Now you start in your practice, whatever that may be, keeping mindfulness and vigilance active throughout. And one does one's practice, concludes, but in line with that pre-motivation you made, still conjoined to the motivation of your practice, you stand up and go about your day, using mindfulness and vigilance throughout the day to ensure that the meditation you engage in this morning, that remains alive and present within you. Minds such as refuge, bodhicitta, and whatever else one meditated on in one's practice, that those remain as your guiding light as you go about your daily activities. And to ensure that happens, you continue to rely on mindfulness and vigilance. Vigilance ensuring that the afflictions are at bay, mindfulness keeping the mind virtuous. And in this way, from spending no more time in formal practice, one is creating great waves of merit. So this is both the skillful way to practice and the indispensable way to transform one's mind. In summary then, with this verse, if one does not rely on mindfulness and vigilance, if one doesn't utilize them continuously, afflictions will continue to arise. One's mind will be distracted, going off to various stories, dominated by the afflictions, and one's merit will remain weak. But if one relies on mindfulness and vigilance, one's mind will stay virtuous. The afflictions will not be able to overwhelm you, or if they do arise, they will be noticed and you will deal with them. And in this way, great waves of merit will quickly be accumulated. This brings us to the 25th verse. Those whose minds lack vigilance, though they study, reflect, and meditate, just like water leaking from a vase, their recollection, their mindfulness will not be stable.
So
this is referring to, pointing out that one's good qualities such as wisdom, whilst one is making some effort, then it's not going to be developed fully. So in the first two lines, those whose minds lack vigilance, though they study, reflect, and meditate, So here we see a practitioner who is making efforts. They are engaged in extensive hearing as well as reading. So they are studying, trying to gather knowledge, and they are thinking about what they are learning and thereby giving rise to some wisdom from their endeavors, from their studies. And they are engaging in some reflection and giving rise to some wisdom from reflection, and they're engaging in general meditation and giving rise to some wisdom from meditation. But because they are not relying adequately on mindfulness and vigilance, whilst their endeavors are not fruitless, the results that they are attaining, in particular, the wisdoms that are, so wisdom may be their intelligence or their knowledge is better than wisdom here. It's the same word, but can be translated differently. So their knowledge and their intelligence that is coming about through their endeavors of hearing, reflecting, and meditating, this intelligence or knowledge remains weak. Why? Because they are not relying on mindfulness and vigilance. And they'll struggle to grow their wisdom or their knowledge or their intelligence. They'll struggle to grow this and have it powerful, again, because of lacking mindfulness and vigilance.
Semdi 차단이 온도 나지 녀mom비 직 차뇨 차비 온도 단 밴딩 아주 야대가 내가 디제거서 내가 딜 파진 어다든 직도스는 내가 망보체 되네게 안지야다 안지게 어다든 아지 투고 지지도고에서라 지지 내가 내고에서라 되네게 봐 에너지게 되네 기시고에서 되네게 전 차단기 차비 온도 송하시네 안직도스네 어느지게特别 somebody 안에도 섬야다 제가 말해도 뒤균도 세균도 고치여도 안지 네 처바디 예마 튀겨되게 잠바 제로야다 잠바지도 되네게 된다 하고 어디게 안지 되네균이 고치도 잠바지 하고 된다 되게 예마 하고 어디게 잠바지 하고 와셔야 되네그 하고 와셔도 곰되게 곰에 예마도 지곰되스 곰에나다 바심디 남에서도 또한전 되네 셈디 곰여도 템부 셈디 템부 네미도 봐 야지 담선함서 초조해 하는 거지 도시는 셈 차的 차배 원도 송바나 차다 차배 유当然的 신전시지 맞된 바지 셈 파 차고 유를 가오ton의 차고 유를 파 차배지도 유를 파 나셔바이나 되는 바지는 제 신인다 대신 앞에 다와다 되는 로모 도신 파 디체소 송전에 송에 되는 바 예마 투버제 야니야의 섬 다야다 된다의 야니의 섬 공부에 마주도 고길에게지 잠바 제로 그래서 냠도 그래서 아야지 되네기야 셈디 지 컨트롤다 되네기 와서도 밀야지 요라시야 저버게야 지 컴퓨터야 되네기 초보자 되네 파도 스타일 셈마이 되네차도 되네기 뒤set다지 아니 퇴비게 자다 선배 되네 야네야의 섬 다이 말도 루신 잠바 제로 그래서 도진 잠바 제로 그래서 제가 되네서 도저 퇴당봉을 저기 퇴비에서 퇴비시 퇴 망고 퇴비 셰랍 여바체 전라 삼삼비기 된다디 하고 셰랍 여바체 되네가도 곰배 셰랍 여바이나 대소 차단 셈들이 하게 무디제 셈 전시진데 무지 마고마제 셈디 전시진 맞되면 연모 원도 송슈도 샤바이나 지클라 니라 송라된도 셈 라요도 아니 간섬지리 아우다 예마 가르시나 가르시나 가르송소 디에 딩민도 세야다 된다 삼 어때 된다 디야제 예마서 이제 공명들 남사다시 공마도 셈디 반 이에 최제 포도시는 요시는 예마게 아주 퇴섬 공비게 셰럽 주여베나 전시지 맞된 바도 샤셰 녀심 녀모 본시 초소 땅도 샤샤베는 대소 냠도 그래 뭐 컴퓨터 줘야 찹라 아 냠도 그래서 제가 될이야 도시 냠도 그래서 그래.
What happens here is that through making efforts, but without relying on mindfulness and vigilance, what good qualities you achieve decline. And these good qualities never become excellent. So one only generates weak good qualities, but even those weak good qualities are not stable. They decline. And this is because one's mind is so easily distracted by various thoughts and the arisal of afflictions, in particular that of attachment. And attachment is the mind that draws us to things that we like. So it can be thoughts of other people or events or things that you want to purchase or have purchased and enjoyed, or whatever it may be. It's a very broad scope of things that the mind is drawn to. And then what one is hearing isn't really heard. What one has heard quickly becomes forgotten. And then through this process of forgetting what one has heard, when you sit down to try and meditate, you forget what you've heard. You don't have much to meditate on. Therefore, not only is the wisdom that arose from hearing, not only was that weak, but it declined. Now from meditation, you're trying to give rise to some wisdom from meditation, but it too is weak because one's not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, and therefore, one's mind is so easily distracted. But what needs to be very clear is this is talking about someone who is making efforts. It says here in the second line, they study, they reflect, they meditate. So virtue is being accumulated. But as we heard before, it is feeble. And the benefits may be being experienced in the mind, such as during meditation. But they fade very quickly. All because of not relying well on mindfulness and vigilance. Then after some months, one looks back and says, yeah, I understand more than I did before, but really I've forgotten much of it. And I've had some good meditation and I've seen some change, but it comes and it goes. It's not very stable. And then again, if through not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, whilst attachment is the most common distraction, when anger arises, then the distraction is even more pronounced. And the obstacle to gaining much benefit from what we are trying to cultivate is so much greater. So this all comes about through not relying continuously on mindfulness and vigilance, both in the formal Dharma settings, as well as the informal, as well as the other times of our day, using mindfulness and vigilance to ensure that our mind stays on the topic. And if one does so, one will keep in mind what one has learned. One will keep in mind what one is meditating on. If not, when you sit down at the end of the day to review your day, you'll realize what you meditated on that morning, it didn't occur to you again until now when you're sitting down to dedicate for the day. So in this way, we need to see that it's indispensable that we rely on mindfulness and vigilance continuously throughout every day.
On do dina shin da chume ba cha de kar san yi ga yo ba za chu de ma sa do ju ni yo ma sa do za de ni chu de dong ba cha do yes in dina shin ya zu ge sem nyo mo cho so da ji dan shi shi ma den ba yin ni ma ga zu ge tue bi shi da san bi shi da gong bi shi da ge yo na ya di shi da de nyam ne yo mo gong bi de chab la ni nyam du ko es kar san jam ba la ni mi ni jam ba la ni de mi ni es shi da so su ge jam ba la tue bi ga tue ba da Sambada Gombati Jengyo Mares, Medemba, Karsinica, Medemba, the Jay, Samada, you would take on Medemba, Samada Jajabaza, the Jengyo, Matemba, Leo Mares, Temple and Meneba, the Jiru, but Medena Jesor, Chezamia Shadow, which is that Mima Tibi Shera, the Sembi Shera, Gombi Shera, Yobaina, a day she's in Matimba Jane, and to Yam Majebeza, Simdipa, Numo, Namia, Numo, which are not in it, T. Numo, D. Jesu Charge, Semdi, the toy, and together. Lucina Chawa Chid, ye tape somebody done some time the community you to sell house on you, didn't go temple and New York matches that temple in Minnepa, it's that yam song is or temple and mint temple jeva is or that temple jeva is that you Yama you at the Mavachas temple and mini diminis.
And Shantideva explains this with an illustration, just like water leaking from a vase. And that is exactly what we are. As a vessel, we have accumulated this water of wisdom. But our lack of mindfulness and vigilance is like this vessel is leaking. we forget what we have heard before, forget what benefit we gained from meditation. This is lost too. And we see this then in the fourth line. Their recollection, their mindfulness will not be stable. So this, I translated one word in two ways. So recollection and mindfulness is the same word. I just translated in both ways. Because of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance, we do not recall what we have heard. We do not recall what arose in our meditation, the clarity that came in our meditation. What we heard, what we studied, this fades away and is forgotten. The insight we gained in our meditation, this we also don't recollect. This also fades away. So therefore, whilst we do gain merit and good qualities through our endeavors, because of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance sufficiently, what we acquire is weak, and even that weak attainment, this fades and is forgotten. What we see here is that through having both faith and inspiration, one makes effort, studies, reflects, meditates, but as we saw in the first line, due to lacking vigilance, the afflictions arise. And then our mindfulness is lost, and we will not recall what we gained. What we heard in the teachings, what we read in the book, will quickly be forgotten. So through the understanding we gained, this is a wisdom, this will fade away. Likewise, through our efforts in meditation, the insight we gained, that wisdom that we gained, this too will fade away. We will struggle to recall. We won't remember last week's teaching. We won't remember the details that we heard or what we meditated on. And we find then, because of not utilizing mindfulness and vigilance well, all these efforts, whilst they bring about some benefit, that benefit is not nearly what it would otherwise have been.
Sanje Kopa Togudu Sembege, Tobasho Sembege, Kolwa Janjusem, Denige Samta, Dene Di Zang Sanje Kopa Tobi and Dalia, that Jignima, Tobi, Sina the Che, Mongoshi Tubada, Tobi some somebody, Cometi, Mount Yadea, the meat, Yemji, Sembe Samdaje, that Dene Simyomo, Sumataji, but D Tobi, Duendi, Ejida, Tobi Sherata. Tibi turned some Jebachi, some of the Yana and the chickens and some that could turbati, Dunda Samba, Dunda, some that Duendilla, Jebajo, Jebachi, Dene, Zukipene, Lay Jundia or Jebachiata, Chicky, Divosia did that, Tiki said that, ye, Kawachi, you Kawatin to go or Sabbath. Dungoyata, you Migawatli to me, but is that the Haukone, Denenge Kawa to be sent some tire. Denege Rachi, you Kawa Tempana, Dinajeta, Unjamin at Anazuki, Luti and Asiatia, as Lule Tempare. She's a Lule Tempa Insa, the Lule Matempa and Asiati, Kai Minduas, the Lule Tene Tapa, Matri, Sabe, some Natushi Chevacha. Dine Chevachine Achik, or Dusine Chevache, Dine Chevachineta, Chesata and Asiata. Yule Tine Taba Samacho Kaya Matimba Gala Tune Taba Mahim Big Tang Hasik, Rang when you to in Saudi Mindua Sembi Chevache, Du Chevache, Chevachine, Dine how go do, Dine Chevadina, Chicken, Ma said, come.
Hey, coupons. Can
Ma said, really tenant.
Indeed, well, I know it's good. Then they
Chesan Lake, you watch a lady, Tibu Kewa, Tegi or there, you Kewalet in Yungo, said, Did and chain. Dunga idea, you Migawalet in Yungo, Chesan Lake, you just said, Miluare, said, Chesan Lake, you Milua Imba, Tibu Kuletin at Tapa Imba, the Pa Chevachetin, Miavarusi, never yet. And there I just yard time to that. Tanga, Pumbo, say, you just came Marwa, you did Marwa. You done as a poor, but you did Marwa. You did my in that ha said it, as you pumble in a tabachima, the pumbola Matuba, Pumbo de Shaji, and I rose and dry chick minua. Chizang as a pumbole dinner, Tabarido, Simbida, Tinjin, Jawachua, Pumungas, Pumbole, Timba, Jawa, you by the part, Java, some. That dinner are going to do some time to dinner. Ma said the pumbole dinner, Tapa, some Jimato. Ma se pumbola dinner, Mata big round. Matu Bachang, Rang when you do the night, Mindua, Sembig, some time. Dinnig some time to dinner damia by Shagua. Dinner some time, dinner, dinnig. Tanga, Kalama, Rang when you saw in Mea, Sembe, some della, Dongbas, Dongsa Telia, and the Patsichu to nature, Trash in dinner, Zichu in Nene, do so, Gonguri, Esura, Chesadi, Gombaina, that is you tell some constant share up to young or one equal to Pigri S, share a person of a Chagri S or that, Chesa. Do shin and Yaman Chego, yes, said Kunlo Jamni Jeta, Chajas in your Gunia, and Tobja, San Yoko, Simja, Tamjig, San Yoko, Toby Childo, and Susuki, Yama Tuba Jabata, Samba, Gombe Dendik, Yane, Yad Janshi, the Yane, Yad Samba do to the Gomode, and share up to you, Gombe to Guani, on the Peche, Funsuma Tugre, Chesa, and do shin of Gongo, yes, the name what a Gongo, do see it, Sesum.
If we don't rely on mindfulness and vigilance, ensuring that they're keeping our mind virtuous, our habituation to the afflictions, the whole of the afflictions have on us, will remain as strong as ever. No radical change will come unless one relies on mindfulness and vigilance. And all the effort that one puts into hearing, reflecting, and meditating, benefit will follow, but it'll be weak. And even that weak benefit that's attained will decline because of not relying on mindfulness and vigilance. So therefore, any aspiration that we have to become a Buddha so as to lead all suffering beings to attain their own liberation from suffering, even such a precious motivation as this, it may arise in dependence on various inspiring causes that inspire one, but the impact it has is not lasting and it fades. And the impact it has doesn't remain when we are engaging with others, especially others that we find challenging. This all comes about because of lacking mindfulness and vigilance. Because if we were to be relying well on mindfulness and vigilance, when we're hearing the teachings, when we're reflecting on the teachings, we'll be very much more concentrated. And then what arises in our mind, we would be able to keep stably because of utilizing mindfulness and vigilance. So for example, if one has a deep understanding or hears teachings of cause and effect, and then reflects well on them, one will come to a deep certainty that from virtue, from the causes which are virtue, happiness follows. From causes which are non-virtuous, suffering follows. This is certain. So if one receives teachings on karma and reflects on them and does so with mindfulness and vigilance, this will have a deep impact on one, because one will be engaging with great attention, and therefore one's understanding will be deeper and it will abide. But if what mindfulness and vigilance is lacking, one may come to some understanding, but that will all too quickly be forgotten, and therefore the influence it has on one is quite limited. Likewise, if one is relying well on mindfulness and vigilance, hearing then teachings on reality, and then engaging in reflection and meditation on these teachings, asking oneself, how does the sense of self appear? And one looks and comes to recognize that the sense of self, the I, appears as if it is something that is independent, it's under its own control, there's a free agency, there's agency. And you say, so where is the self? Well, it appears as if it's something independent of the aggregates, as if it is in control over the body and mind, something separate from the body and mind. And this is how it appears, which means it must exist by way of its own nature or essence or characteristics. Then, once this is what one has learned, and now one is looking and one sees this is how the self appears. And utilizing mindfulness and vigilance, one recalls well one's teachings, and now one looks in a concentrated way and recognizes no such self exists. There is no inherently existent self that is independent of the body and mind, but controls the body and mind. Rather, the self is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates. That is all. So the self is therefore empty of existing by way of its own nature, which is how it appears, but it exists merely labeled onto the aggregates. In this way, one comes to a deep understanding of reality, the reality that the self is and lacks inherent existence. So this then, when engaged in teachings and reflection and meditation on selflessness with mindfulness and vigilance, one will hear those teachings in a different way, and one's meditation on them will be different, which means it will have a more profound impact, an impact that has an impact on the way we live our lives. So to bring about such transformation, relying on mindfulness and vigilance is indispensable. We come to the 26th verse. Those who are learned have deep faith and make diligent effort in a number of ways. Nevertheless, due to the fault of lacking vigilance, become sullied by downfalls. So this refers to those who have made diligent effort in a number of ways. So they've heard many teachings, they've studied many topics, and in doing so have given rise to a deep, heartfelt faith in the Buddha and his teachings. And because there is this interconnection, that through hearing teachings, their faith has developed, and therefore they make more efforts. And through making more diligent efforts, they hear ever more teachings, and this leads to their faith growing ever further, and they are ever more diligent.
Dine ki mangbochi, dine mangbochi, that is Yamle dus Nangor, Dina, Jen Gabriel, Jen Shijin Matimbache, Shijin Mipe, Chape, Yun Chape, Dongwen Yoda, Jever, Shide, Tisa Diniki Rabjun Rubuchina, Deniki Yamle Chicken, Tuba Mondo, Sanyu Chola, and Devache, Rabdu Chung, Deniki giving Yamle Pezu Sheja, Chunrich, Usin Yamle Nangores, Dine Nang Kashida, Gabriel, Jen Shijin Matimbache, Sendi, Nyomo Bochoso, Matin Nyomo Bocho, Dangdu, Yule Chawaki, Dine Chawaki, Chawa Shushamaki, Chabu Gunjene, and then Garsuri, Sosugi, that chicken Yabatan gave Lavalice, Duma, Yavaki Mures, Duma that, Dungin Yota, Jever, Jerusalem, Bene, chicken, Timisawa Bala Sobata, to Sebana, then they could do parts and they could Yota Jever, to sit in the Yavati, Yoba sitting, doing Yavaki, Yoba sitting, Yavati, J. Kiongresine, to Chigo SS.
The first two lines, the practitioner is making effort in many ways. So this was referring to this interdependent relationship through gathering knowledge, hearing many teachings, leading to one's faith growing ever deeper, and one's diligent efforts, one's effort becoming ever more diligent, and therefore leading one to engage ever more in the teachings, one's faith deepening further still, and one engaging ever more diligently with efforts. So this was looked at, this is the meaning of in a number of ways. So this circular relationship, this interdependent relationship. So despite doing that, the third line, nevertheless, due to the fault of lacking vigilance, so despite perhaps a lengthy period of making a deep effort, a diligent effort due to this deep faith coming about through a gathering of knowledge, due to lacking vigilance, then many of the good qualities they have attained degenerate or become lost. So this person may well have, due to their diligent efforts, engaged in lots of studies and developed deep faith, and therefore took vows such as the vows of the ordained. But due to now lacking vigilance, when afflictions such as attachment, it's a sexual attachment, arose, their vigilance not being present, wasn't even aware. Sexual attachment arises, dominates the mind of the ordained person, and they end up committing a downfall. So this, despite all the endeavors, due to lacking vigilance, they end up receiving a great loss.
Tene izin da kewale bizuye je nyamlen jege chi bainaya Gabriela anachi dan shi jin ma dian ba che sem de nyom mo chu su da sha baina Gabriela cha bei won de song ne anachi ge yang ge do ma da ge bi ge nya ba che je ya ji ma ane da lo de ya yung go de yang ge de da ma lo ba ne di ba chi bo sa yung go de Gabriela anchi yang kong zhe sem ma song je nyom mo chu da sem de kong de chim bo ta kong zhe wang ge Bendigo on the says, J. Sausage about Sopa that in the other, and socially never the Cavalligo is, never than Cavalligo is, Jesada, Denegi, Toy, Yoda, Jeva, Jus, Sanji, Jeva, and gave you Duma, and never Kigo is, to say, Kigo is, Digarson, changes in muscle in the Mukora, Chick Teba, Teba Munguba, Sanji, Deva Yoba, and Chick make a Yamjo, Yamlen, Pezuji, Sunji, or the 한치 가브리엘의 디니기 자해시지 마소의建议 녀모바 계제 녀모바 디왕게 안상이 제바단 가이비게 한동화 계제는 예바 기고를 해서지 중도
This verse describes someone who's making diligent efforts in the Dharma, and this is leading to their learning, is leading to ever deepening faith, them receiving vows such as the vows of the ordained. So this really is a life that is being well lived. But due to lacking mindfulness and vigilance, an affliction such as attachment, but it could be another, arises, deceives the mind, and this person may end up either returning their vows or their vows degenerating and they're creating a lot of non-virtue. Or Again, for an ordained or a non-ordained person, an affliction other than attachment can arise, and without vigilance, it won't be even noticed. And the mind then can be overwhelmed by anger, and the person ends up in conflict. Any outcome such as this, which comes about due to the lack of mindfulness and vigilance, is actually desperately sad, because to have such an outcome from a life that could have been so well lived is really disheartening. So we need to rely on mindfulness and vigilance because of the grave danger the afflictions pose to us. And if we are relying well on mindfulness and vigilance, we will recognize that the afflictions only pose danger, only bring harm. And through relying on mindfulness and vigilance, we can keep them at bay, and thereby our life will be a life well lived.
Oh yeah, yeah. 其他人啊，这个你听不到，所以呢，他们的全门我学上业里啊，你对吧？去，你学了对吧的一切全门我人们特别去学，但那样给予人们的被吹谢谢，给予人们这个月为那样，个别里啊，谢谢真谢谢买点吧，这什么样么个我说的，这样的差别我们给的，然后呢，那些当我们给吧，那有么我们给现在。另外是告诉你讲话，地方里还蛮不巧用过的。天天地方去的动物要他接吧，就是动物现在当然是说了嘛，接吧去个牛毛把给用过的，其实牛把是的，去了马上长门那个牛把是的，动物是说了接吧就牛毛把地把啥用过的也是。其实这个啥吧，这个是能用可能去了地方没办法的，去了地方有的地方忙不起来，可能给为你们如果的那个的这些事情把点把这什么牛毛就是当时的牛毛的地方的很多些呢，没有就帮个出人难改一个，那这个地方啥的，那的呢说了把这边这边就都啥个的，我都那地方的送团。
The meaning of the verse in brief then is that whether someone is ordained or not, having deep faith in the Buddha Dharma, one makes effort to accumulate virtue through the process of hearing, reflecting, meditating. But if one lacks mindfulness and vigilance, the afflictions will continue to arise. And despite one being knowledgeable, despite one engaging in virtuous practices like meditation and so forth, one's afflictions continue to overwhelm one, continue to dominate. And then, despite some virtue having been accumulated, afflictions arise, and non-virtue is now accumulated. Attachment arises, anger arises, and non-virtue is accumulated. And this is how downfalls come. So this term downfalls, literally, it is the word for falling down. That it's both refers to degenerated vows or falling down to the lower realms. So we should be clear that even those who are diligent in efforts in a number of ways, and therefore are learned and have deep faith, if they don't rely on vigilance and mindfulness, their afflictions will continue to lead to them accumulating non-virtue. And if they accumulate powerful non-virtue, they too will fall to the lower realms. So we mustn't allow our confused ignorance to deceive us, thinking that practitioners of the Dharma are safe from falling to the lower realms. That is not necessarily the case. It is, moreover, don't let your confused ignorance deceive you that good people, kind-hearted people, cannot fall to the lower realms. The afflictions arise, non-virtue is created. Should it be non-virtue that ripens at the time of death, one will fall down to the lower realms.
I don't know, like I some was down on the negative, she might be better than unique, Chig and Teba Mongoche, and a gave Chig Devache, Gawale Pezu, Chihuda, to go into your and then she might be better, Gabriel Deniki, and take that no more Kecha, don't Deniki, Yam, Chipashi, water, Dini and Sada, do that number of Condoran, 这些事情，这些sem的有么不说说，当下的把送钱，给别吃完了，别去其实那么远的，每天我都给钱没得，才送我了。人家写完那他说说给学写完这些，东华毛个吧，这天天给学写完这些，光年我都拍他， 얘기 좀 하는 거래서 지난도 시작하되 계신 거래요. 송월.
A brief summary to take away is we need to make effort in virtue. We need to strengthen our habituation to virtuous ways of thinking. And for this to produce a transformation of our mind, we have to rely on mindfulness and vigilance, ensuring that not solely in informal situations like this, but at all times, we're using mindfulness and vigilance to keep our mind on virtue and prevent the rise of afflictions. Because if we don't, perhaps almost immediately, but certainly very soon, the afflictions that we are so deeply habituated to will arise and deceive our mind, mislead us. So therefore, at all times and in all situations, we need to rely on mindfulness and vigilance. And to the extent we do, the virtue we accumulate will be of great strength and have a transformative impact on our mind, enabling rapid spiritual development.
Semdi nyomo be choso paya toya de paka de sun simni kiwi choso trotu de jewa de kechen bories chizang ndoshine jewa ina ngazo kiwi chawa karu tuwe ine ya ene gewa di ngo kone kudu pya chagiri mado gewa roji tuwe ine semdi jimba songwa che pa namya che nyomo be choso tangsha ba ina gewa karu tuwe ine che gewa chunjuji mado nipa chimbo ya yo mare, yarki trotu ya yo mare, mazi meba mazi janshi jima timba che dushin semdi nyombo be chus pa yangwa pandamiya pa tangsha be ine, dili nyamba ge shin shebi yuande digi pazama nje de nyamdo ya nyanga chimbo yo re, dili yenzada piti ine janshi jine de sem nyombo chus ma tangwa che, ine kuno jam te cha ju sem yu kune na, dili mipa topja san yu go pa tubi chirdo, ane dushine and she did send the normal but shows died part but Jambius, she Jambius Songjet, seemed to give it Janja some died, come Yamnesha the kitchen, said to anybody, and didn't say to answer.
And lastly, just to remind you of a point raised earlier, when you do whatever virtuous activity you're engaging in, whether it's your daily commitments, some extra meditation or making offerings or circumambulation or coming to teachings, start every virtuous activity just before refuge and bodhicitta with the commitment, I will rely on mindfulness and vigilance from now throughout this virtuous activity and throughout the rest of this day. Make this commitment because by relying on mindfulness and vigilance, that virtuous activity will produce a far greater result. You'll keep your distracted mind at bay. You'll accumulate so much more merit. And whatever insight you come to in your meditation, that will remain with you. So make this commitment to mindfulness and vigilance, and then start your practice, which will always start with refuge and bodhicitta. And then you continue, whether it's the meditations as described in your daily commitments, or meditation on another topic of the Lamrim, or maybe making offerings or prostrations, whatever it may be. Start, even before refuge and bodhicitta, with the commitment to mindfulness and vigilance, and make that commitment that I will do so now throughout the session and throughout the day. And in this way, train yourself that whatever you're doing, you're watching your mind. You're primarily focused not on the outer world, but on your mind, making sure that whilst you engage in the various activities, your mind is staying free of the afflictions. And in this way, you'll accumulate so much more merit as you go about your daily life and when you engage in explicit virtuous activities.
곧 소수게 대바의 시신 야고를 선마 시스템된 남이야 시셔번에 내가 노트쇼에 년가 친구도와 제가 나중에 얘네 레라직 지딘비 저와 하루는 대바의 시 야고를 제배네 지금 내가 만노와다 야고 지 용거로 봐 근데 나시 땅에 기회 자원님네 제발했다 이 제보 계시 못 찾으거든.
Just like no one uses a cup that you know to be leaking, seal your mind with mindfulness and vigilance, thereby ensuring that virtue remains within and the afflictions remain outside. And this way, your life becomes transformed and truly meaningful.
예, 하셨습니다.
Then thank you. We can conclude there tonight. Thank you.